Hi there, I'm Rachel Fershleiser from Counterpoint Press, and I am so excited to be here today with S. Kirk Walsh, the author of The Elephant of Belfast.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting us.
This is a really special work of historical fiction that is an Indie Next pick from America's booksellers, and that a lot of librarians have told me they've really responded to. It's getting great reviews, and we're really, really excited to share it with all of you here today. So just to start, Kirk, could you tell us a little bit about the book and how you had the idea to write it?
So I heard about this idea of the elephant angel, in real life, her name is Denise Austin. And it was on the radio because the Belfast Zoo, it was their 75th anniversary. And they had all these photos of the woman who took care of a young elephant during the Belfast Blitz, but they didn't know who she was. And so they did a campaign, and quickly thereafter, her last living relative called up and identified her. And I think I was among the millions of people who heard this story. And I thought, kind of put it in my back pocket and thought, oh, this would make a great novel. And my dad's side of the family is originally from Ireland and heavily identified as Irish Catholics. And I always knew I wanted to write something set in Ireland, but didn't expect to end up in Belfast. So that was sort of the initial idea. And then I started doing research and found traction in the story as a writer.
Since we're here with a bunch of librarians who are probably interested in this sort of thing, can you tell us more about how you did the research, both into the history and into elephants?
Yeah, so it was kind of bifurcated, both the historical and the elephant research, just because I really needed to learn a lot to write the book. I did write my first draft. I tried to write, so I took a research trip to Belfast in the summer of 2013. And before I took that trip, I did try to get through a first draft just so I could kind of have a relationship to the story in my imagination before I saw all the sights and sounds of the city. And so when I went there, I went to the Northern Ireland War Memorial, and there was a man there named John Hughes who's since passed away. But he basically introduced me to four survivors of the Belfast Blitz and gave me introductions so that I could interview them. And when I was in Belfast, he drove me to one of their houses at Vance Rogers, and I sat in his study as he told me his experience when he was 18 years old, being actually today's the 80th anniversary of the Easter Tuesday bombings, and he was in a office building in downtown Belfast when that happened. And the following morning, he rode his bike, kind of the way my main character, her name's Hetty Quinn, the female zookeeper, rides her bike. But when I interviewed Vance Rogers, that really was the moment where I began to see that I could have some access to the story because I had lived in New York City during the attacks of September 11th. And just the way he described the smells, the shattered glass, the ashes that covered, there's lots of iconic images from September 11th of the tea set covered in ashes and shoes. And also just how office papers would drift up the island. And the same thing happened in Belfast. And so that sort of was where I kind of was like, maybe I can do this. But at the museum, they did have the original newspapers of the days that followed the Blitz, and their main newspaper is called the Belfast Telegraph. And this being, I had to wear plastic gloves, but it was amazing to be able to read those articles. And, the news was a little censored. They didn't want the full scope of the violence. They didn't want to alarm people, but it was quite similar. The Easter Tuesday bombings, about 1,000 civilians died, a little under, and that also was similar to the attacks in New York. And so I also went to the Belfast Zoo, and when I arrived there, I was taken to the office of the executive director of the zoo, and he really, yeah, he's like, on a clear day, you can see Scotland. And I was like, I need to know more than that. Yeah, he didn't have a lot of information about what happened at the zoo during, I mean, as much as I knew from what I read. Um, and thankfully, there's a zookeeper there named Raymond Robinson, who is referred to as the informal historian of the zoo. And he just really, it was invaluable, the conversations we had and walking around the zoo. And then the old zoo exists still below the new zoo. And we went to the elephant house that I write about in the novel, and it's dilapidated and overgrown with weeds. But to be able to stand inside that structure for as a novelist, I took that experience with me back to Texas. Um,
Yeah.
but I
And you
did,
also got to meet some elephants in Texas, is that right?
yeah. So I came home and I did meet some elephants in Belfast, but really the focus was on the place there and the people and the shipyards and getting to know the city. But then I came home and needed to meet some elephants just because Violet, the name of my elephant, appears in a lot of the book. And I was lucky enough to connect with Daryl Hoffman, who's the large mammal curator at the Houston Zoo. And they have one of the few multi-generational Asian elephant families in the country. And I also went there, I went a couple times in 2013 after my Belfast trip. And they had 2 3-year-old elephants, and that's the age of my, in the real story and in my novel, the elephant is 3 years old. And to be able to, and so I arrived there and I thought they were just going to kind of have me be on the sidelines and observe their cleanings and feedings and trainings. And they said to me, "Would you like to wash the elephant?" And I was just like, really? um, so that was extraordinary, just to be able to touch an elephant, to watch an elephant. The second time I went, they were doing an ultrasound of one of the older female elephants because she was pregnant. And it was, I mean, it's a little, was a messy operation to say the least. But there were 4 or 5 zookeepers in plastic smocks and gloves, and they basically had to clean out the rectum of this elephant. And yeah, but then
And
the
it
two,
was beautiful, and life is beautiful.
yeah, but the thing is, they were calm. They were amazing. And after I witnessed that, I kind of was like, this is all I need to know. Like being able to see how respectful they were towards the
Yeah.
animal, that they completed the procedure, the animal was never in pain. And I just, in now that the book is out, I've reflected a lot on the research, both in Texas and Belfast. And then I also traveled, being a former New Yorker, I do come back to the city a lot. And, the New York Public Library, particularly the main branch, is an extraordinary resource. And in the map room, I could look at maps from the late 30s of Belfast. The mass observation is on record there. So even though it was mostly diaries of people who experienced the London Blitz, it was firsthand accounts of people who had
Yeah.
experienced the Blitz. So it really, it was an amazing, I learned so much
Yeah.
in the writing.
Thank you. We only have about 1 more minute. I just wanted to ask you, I've heard from a lot of librarians and readers that they love this book for book groups and discussions. And I was wondering what you most hope people will have discussions about after they read this book.
Well, given what we've been through in the past 13 months, I hope that it offers hope in how we can get through difficult times, and that we can find grace and kind of peace in unexpected places, whether it's a relationship with an animal. I mean, I do know there's been kind of a trend of pandemic puppies, but I think it's, it has been a really difficult year. And my hope is that people will read the book and see the humanity, and that we can become strong when we least expect it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, S. Kirk Walsh. I hope that you will all pick up The Elephant of Belfast. It is such a beautiful book. Thank
Thank you, Rachel.
Hi, I'm Lee Boudreau, and I'm an executive editor at Doubleday, where I focus almost exclusively on publishing fiction. And there is nothing more fun than finding a brand new talent in your inbox. And that is what we're here to talk about today. Stacey Swann is with us, and thank you to the Texas Library Association. We are both so glad to be here. And Stacey, your book, I always say, is packed to the absolute rafters with all the good things, with infidelity and secrets and lies and betrayals, all the thing that just makes family family. So tell us a little bit, if you will, about your debut novel, Olympus, Texas.
Absolutely, and thanks to everyone for watching. So Olympus, Texas kicks off when March Briscoe comes back to his hometown of Olympus, which is in rural East Texas, 2 years since he was last there. And March left town because he had an affair that came to light with his brother's wife. So of course, coming back, his brother is none too happy to see him. And also his mother is not happy that he's returned to town either. March reminds his mother, June, too much of her husband, Peter. They both had affairs, and in fact, Peter has as many children out of wedlock as he does with his wife, June, and they were all conceived after they got married. So there's a lot of history and baggage there. And March coming back into town kicks off a chain of events that takes place over the course of the week, where the family really has to grapple with the ways that they have failed each other.
So a lot of first novels take a certain autobiographical tack, which we will assume, given that description, is not the case with you. But you also did something extraordinary, I think, which is somewhere along the way you decided that classical mythology, the Roman and the Greek gods, could be a framework for this novel set in small town Texas. Now, tell me, when did that idea occur to you, and how did you grapple with that very ambitious sort of scaffolding?
Well, it actually was the very first idea I had for the novel before I had any of the characters. I was just thinking about Greek mythology, and then also Texas mythology. We're a state that we tend to really buy into our own myths and this idea that everything is bigger in Texas. We have lots of larger than life characters. And it seemed to me a really great fit with Greek mythology. And so I got to sit down and work on the novel, thinking of it as almost like a game. How do I take these Greek gods and goddesses and translate them into just regular humans living in modern Texas, and just using their big traits, morph them into these characters? And so I started that way, which was a ton of fun. And it was only after I'd been working on the draft quite a while that I stood back and realized, oh, actually what I'm working on is a novel about a dysfunctional family, that I had never thought of the Greek god, that pantheon as just one big dysfunctional family, but really they are, especially when you distill them down into humans.
And we all can point to several novels, dysfunctional families at their heart. Were they an influence for you? Talk about some of the books that you loved that fed into this view of your own novel.
Absolutely. Like, I have always really loved novels about big dysfunctional families. And I think part of it is because they're all characters that can't hide anything from each other. They know each other so well that they can't pretend to be other people. They have to be fully who they are. And even like Pride and Prejudice is one of my favorite novels. So you have the giant Bennett family. And more recently, I really loved Angela Flournoy's The Turner House, which is 13 children and their parents.
Right, of course. Now, I am from a tiny little town in rural Virginia. You are from a small town in Texas. What do you make of the unique character of a small town and a small town novel?
That also is a type of story I always love, something set in a small town. I love Richard Russo's work, which really conjures that feeling of small town. I remember reading Horsemen Pass By Larry McMurtry when I was in grad school, and I was like, oh, that is exactly rural Texas. And so that's always a story that I've been drawn to. And in a way, I feel like small towns are almost like family novels in that everyone knows everyone, and you can't get away from your past history because it's known to everyone that you encounter on the road. And so that was something that I had a lot of fun building in, was thinking about this town of Olympus, which is slightly like the town I grew up in, Sealy, Texas, which is kind of outside of Houston, but also a lot of fictional elements in it as well.
And one of the things that spoke so strongly to me reading the novel, first, there is this outsized setting, this sense of place, which is so beautifully created on the page, the sort of long gravel roads of the only place that has felt like home, as March is thinking when he's first returning to town. But the other thing that just seared itself on my brain was the female characters in the novel. June, who of course is sort of, loosely based on Juno, and Vera, who has elements of Venus, and Artie, who has certain echoes of Artemis. Talk a little bit, if you will, about these particularly strong female characters enmeshed in very complicated dynamics, and even, perhaps the expectations that come to accrue on women today, always, in small towns in particular sometimes.
Absolutely. I feel like those of us that have spent time in small towns anywhere in the US, you get an almost outsized feeling of gender roles and expectations, just because there's often such a strong tie to tradition in those communities, and those roles feel kind of locked in, even down to the way that, right, like churches kind of organize the men's group and the women's group and the kind of duties that they're assigned. And I think what really drew me initially, and why I loved June so much as a character, is I remember reading about Hera, or Juno is her name in Roman mythology, when I was a kid. And I feel like when we read those stories about Hera in Greek myth, they're very much through like Zeus's eyes, or like the patriarchy's eyes. We look at her as like this really angry woman who's causing lots of trouble for other poor women who don't deserve it. Meanwhile, Zeus is off, slightly off stage, getting no blame at all for all of the things that he's doing to make his wife really angry. And so in getting to explore June, I wanted to take those elements of Hera, and stay true to them, like her anger, but also see the marriage through her eyes. And so you have a much more grounding in what she's having to put up with. I also was really drawn to the idea that, like, culturally, when we talk about forgiveness, quite often we put the burden of the work of forgiving people on the person who's been wronged, instead of the person who has done the wronging. We're like, you have to do the work to find it in your heart to forgive someone. And so in using June, I got to explore this idea of, like, with forgiveness, what's the work that people have to do to achieve forgiveness, on both sides.
Excellent. Well, Stacey, thank you so much for being here to talk about Olympus, Texas. And again, thank you, librarians, for helping spread the word about debut novels. We all appreciate everything you do, and I hope you love Olympus, Texas. I just got my very first copy in the mail literally this morning, so it's coming your way soon. Thank you all very much. Bye.
Bye.
Hello, librarians of Texas. My name is Jen Marshall, and I'm a literary agent, and I have the honor today of talking with historian Katherine Sharp Landdeck about her book, The Women with Silver Wings, which is just out in trade paperback from Crown. Here it is. And I'm not just a literary agent, I'm Kate's agent. And so I'm so excited to be here talking with you. This riveting work of history, which reads like a novel at times, is the story of the very first women ever to fly for the US military. They were known as the WASP, which is short for Women Air Force Service Pilots, and they flew during World War II. Kate's book has received absolutely glowing reviews from the media and from readers around the country. And that's for an excellent reason. There isn't another person alive who knows more about these courageous, trailblazing women pilots than Kate. And this story is both personal and professional for her. And that's really where I want to start, because the seeds for this book began 28 years ago with a surprise discovery. And I think that's super cool because none of us knows what's around the corner. And it just might be something that will transform your life in astonishing ways. Kate, can you tell us about the day that you found what would become your life's work?
Sure, absolutely, Jen. And thanks for asking, and thanks for being here, and thanks to those who are watching. I appreciate it. So, it's not every day or every person who gets the opportunity to have that one moment in time that changes the entire trajectory of your life. And June of 1993 was it for me. I went to an air show. I was living in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and was working at a flight school. I had a shiny new bachelor's degree in history. And I went up to this air show in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, a big biplane expo, and just happened to meet a pilot that introduced me to Curtis Pitts, an aircraft designer of really fun airplanes. And he turned as we were chatting and introduced the woman next to him and said, well, this is Carol Bailey Bosca, and she won the 1951 aerobatic championship in my second airplane. I was like, what are you talking about? I didn't know women had done that in the 1950s. I knew they'd, Amelia Earhart and all of that, but didn't know women had done that. And then as we talked, Carol revealed the fact that she'd done flying in World War II for the Army Air Forces. And I was completely blown away. That was it. What are you talking about? And we talked more, and she, had flown B-25s and B-26s and P-38s, all these big World War II bombers or those pursuit planes that you see in all the movies. And I had never heard of this before. I couldn't believe it. And I went back, I was working at a flight school in Tulsa, and I went back and talked to all the guys about this, and they'd never heard of these women either. They thought I was making it up. So I decided then and there that was ridiculous. How inspiring could their story be to people to know that women had done this in World War II? So I started doing research. I went and bought the one or two books that had been written on them, kind of memoirs, and really started doing my research. I went to graduate school so that I could learn to write history the right way. And really be a serious scholar of these women, and moved my whole professional path around these women, and started doing oral histories, did all sorts of different writings about them, and just have been so fortunate to have really been able to shape my life's path around their story and gathering their story and sharing their story, because I think it's just so very inspirational.
It really is, Kate. And I think that because of your work, their story is known to the world today. And that's an amazing, amazing accomplishment. And so, years into this research, because, really, realistically, you're still doing it. You're never going to stop.
That's true. That's true.
Digging into the story of the WASP ever. I know you. but years into this research, you sit down to write this book, and you have an embarrassment of riches. Because you are the historian.
Yeah.
And so you have to decide, how are you going to tell this enormous arc, which starts with these women being told, no, you can't fly. You cannot do it. The military not only doesn't need you, but it doesn't want you. And then they get to do it, through their own hard work. Then they're disbanded. Then they're erased. And then they have another fight again to be recognized as veterans, to be allowed to be buried at Arlington, which they achieve. But that's a huge story to tell.
It is such a huge story.
It's huge. And, I give you so much credit because you've achieved it. And the way that you did that was by focusing on a narrow set of women that you knew, and you made them into characters almost in a novelistic way, except everything is true. And I think a great place to start here would be for you to introduce a couple of those characters to us
Sure.
because we're your friends.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think you're quite right. This was, I'd done research on these women for serious research for over 25 years and had so much. And, there were 1,102 of them who wore those silver wings that we named the book for. And to choose them, how to tell it. And, not a lot of people know this, but I think librarians are book people. So they get this a little, I have on the wall right behind me 8 full 3-ring binders of full drafts of this book that I wrote that kept getting shorter and shorter because it was so big, and I knew everything that was going on in it, but then other people would read it and say, what, there's too many people, there's too many pieces of the story. And so I really did have to kind of rethink how I was going to tell this story so that people could understand it. And I didn't want to just tell that World War II story. I wanted to tell the whole story because their lives after the war were so interesting, what they were able to do, what they couldn't do, and those lives in the 70s when they're fighting to be recognized. And as you said, all the way to Arlington National Cemetery just a few years ago. So I really worked hard I had to find, characters. This is completely nonfiction, as you said, everything's true. Everything kind of follows the rule of 3 of, corroboration on these facts. But I wanted to write it in a way that people would read it, that my mother would enjoy it. And she's not a historian. And so I chose people that would follow us all the way through the story, people whose story I could tell beginning, middle, and end along the whole trajectory. And I wanted to also pick people that I knew, people that I had met. And so that's, I've got these kind of lead characters that I follow all the way through. I think a couple of the most interesting ones, Jacqueline Cochran, of course, I didn't know she died in 1980, but she was just an amazing personality, so complex, so complicated, a personality, grows up poor in the sawmills of Florida, and then goes on to be one of the most famous women pilots in the world, really rivals with Amelia Earhart in the competitions and popularity of the day, and just an incredible businesswoman and really very stubborn and determined to give women the chance to fly, give herself the chance to fly some of these sophisticated airplanes. And so she's one of those that I didn't know, but really carries us through those war years and pre-war years and that fight to get these women in the airplanes. And then one that you can't say they're your favorites, right? But I think Teresa James was one that I knew Teresa well. She was funny and smart, and God, she could make you laugh. She was so funny. And she really started flying in the 1930s and was an air show pilot and all of those things, and was a ferry pilot. So she helps me tell the story of those ferry pilots and then follow her through the war years and into that post-war life with her personal story. I get lots of letters from readers about they never cried during a nonfiction book before. And I even had my own sister call me and say, you can't do this. You can't do this in this story. And I'm like, it's nonfiction. So I think, these characters really, I've heard from a lot of readers that they really come to life, and that makes me feel so good because these women, I knew these women, and to be able to make them come to life to others just means the world to me.
Yeah, Kate, that's the feedback that I get from readers all the time who read your book, that Jackie and Teresa, I mean, they are larger than life. Mm-hmm. And, Jackie's such a badass, like the world know about her. I mean,
she's so complicated.
She's so complicated, and she could have a book in her own right. Mm-hmm. And one thing I want to be sure that people watching this know is that Jackie started the WASP with another woman, Nancy Love. Yeah. And Nancy and Jackie, were at odds so much of the time. And I found that fascinating because they had such differing views of what women could and should be doing. And yet they were both responsible for creating the WASP. Without the two of them, without their drive and, refusal to take no for an answer, I don't think we would have had the WASP. And you elevate them and bring both of them totally to life. So
well, I appreciate that. And of course, their relationship is so complicated. You and I have talked about the fact that they should have been friends.
they should have.
They should have been friends. They had so much in common, but it just didn't work out. but yeah, they were so powerful, both of them in their own right. And it was such a pleasure to kind of get to know them both. Of course, Nancy died before I got to know her as well. And to be able to bring them to life has been such a pleasure.
Well, I think it's so important because they really were female military leaders long before we have come to expect that to be part of our history.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that should be erased. And because of you, it's not going to be.
Well, thanks.
And speaking of that, this book was, absolutely, I remember you writing it. It was just a race against time. You very badly wanted to finish this book in time for as many surviving WASP as possible to be able to read it.
Yeah.
And yet it was this enormous task because you also wanted to do it right, of course. And, I'm so happy for you that it did get done in time. There are WASP who are able to read it. And I think it would be really interesting to hear what that's been like for you to share this book with the WASP who are still living, and what did they think about it?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it. And that's one of the hardest things about writing a book about living people, and especially living people that personally, is it's like, ooh, are they going to like it? But they knew, and they wanted me to be honest and to tell the story. And, that was very hard. Marty Weil, who's one of the leads, died while I was in the process. But she and I talked every 2 weeks as I was writing it, and she was so pleased with the direction it was going. But yeah, B. Haydu, Mickey Bright, Mickey has been, Nell Bright has been doing talks with me, and she's so proud, and she keeps buying copies and giving it to people because she just loves that the story is being told. And of course, her photo is in it in the very beginning, and she is so strong and beautiful. But it's been quite the pleasure to have them say, yeah, you got it right, and that they know that the story is being told and going to go forward. And I've been in touch with a lot of their kids as well, which has really meant a lot, that they're like, I never even knew this about my mom's story. And you've added so much to my understanding of what she did and what her life was like. And that's really meant a lot too, to have that connection to the families of the WASP as well.
Yeah, that just must be so moving, and just an incredible feeling. I've often thought too, what do the WASP hope people take away from their efforts and from their journey? I find them incredibly inspiring.
Yeah.
But I wonder, what they think today about readers. And
yeah. Over the years, I've asked them that question, what do you want people to walk away remembering? And many of them said, we were first, and that was a big part of it. But, over the last 20 years, that message has kind of changed to, you're going to have your own path that you want to forge, and you should do that. You'll find your right people if you follow your own path. And I think that's an important message. And, their story is filled with successes, but also failures, and you're going to fail sometimes, but, keep pushing and don't give up, and you'll have a good life.
I love that. Okay, just one more quick question.
Sure.
You are a public historian. Can you tell our viewers what exactly that is, and let us know if there are other historians writing in this way whom you admire and who perhaps influenced the Women with Silver Wings?
Yeah, absolutely. I've made that conscious decision to write this in a public way for a different audience, not for an strictly academic audience. And that was a big shift in thinking. This isn't a university press, this is Crown. And I'm so grateful for your help mentoring me through that process and that kind of mind shift, because I wanted to tell that story broadly, but still be a good professional historian. And I did follow the inspiration of a number of historians that are doing that type of thing. I think H.W. Brands and his book, Age of Gold, was the first one that I actually cheered out loud when Molly's parents made it over the mountains and they were going to survive. And, it's like, oh, you can cheer in books if it's written right, even if it's good nonfiction. And then as I was writing, I went to Eric Larson a lot, and his book, Dead Wake, and the way he described scenes using different resources, using films, and the scene that Eric Larson describes of the Lusitania pulling out from port and the captain turning back and looking at the shore as they pulled away. It's like, oh, I can feel it. I can see it. And how did he do that? And I looked at his sources and I found the video that he had watched to write that scene. It's like light bulbs going off that you could do this. You could draw the scenes and still be historically accurate. So I went back to that book, Dead Wake, a lot when I'd get stuck in my own spots I'd realize I'd written it kind of academically. It's no, we're not going to do this. And I'd go back and read how he worked through some of those problems and tried to shape my writing that way. Not saying I'm as good as Eric Larson, not at all, but he was definitely a model for me. And I think that's really important as a writer to have those stories that we can look at, to learn how to be better every time we write.
I agree. And I think both of those authors are incredibly talented, as are you.
Well, I try. I don't know. I'm not there, but I'm trying.
So I think our time is up. And so I want to thank the librarians for watching, for all the work that they do. And I wish that I was with Kate in Texas right now, enjoying the weather and margaritas. And I'm very sorry I'm not. So
Me too.
Post-COVID, that can happen.
That's right.
The book is The Women with Silver Wings, out from Crown and paperback. And thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you, Jen. I appreciate it. And thanks to all the librarians, and hopefully we'll see you in person next time.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Danielle Perez, an executive editor at Berkeley, and I'm May Cobb's editor here. And I'm here to talk with her about her new book, The Hunting Wives, which goes on sale May 18th. Everyone at Berkeley is so incredibly excited to share this book with readers, and I'm so happy to be here with you today, May. To get started, can you tell us just a little bit about the book?
Absolutely. And I'm so excited to be here with you too, Danielle. And so The Hunting Wives is a thriller, and it follows Sophie, who is a young mother and wife. And Sophie has grown weary of her fast-paced, glamorous magazine job in Chicago, and she's longing for like a slowed down, idyllic life. So she moves her husband and adorable child to Mapleton, Texas, which is a fictional town in rural Texas. And when she gets there, it's all fun and games at first, and they go berry picking and whatnot, but then she finds herself really bored and restless. And she soon crosses paths with this alluring socialite named Margot Banks. And Margot is sort of the mean girl ringleader of a secret clique known as the Hunting Wives. And Sophie is soon swept up into their world of late night partying, skeet shooting, and getting up to pretty bad behavioral things. And so soon she finds her life spiraling out of control, and there's a murder, and I don't want to give any more away than that, but that's pretty much it.
Great. Well, these characters are so devious and so compelling. What was your inspiration for the characters and for this story?
A real quick backstory for the inspiration is I was driving on the country roads with my mother, who still lives up in East Texas. And she told me about when she was in high school, there was a clique of rich guys. And on the weekends, they would invite people out to go to something called the hunting party. And they would basically just go into the woods and park their gigantic cars, because this was in the 60s, and they would sit, you know, and drink beer and sit on the hood of their cars and shoot, and sometimes shoot at rabbits and other little animals. And my mom did not know that's what was going down, by the way. So she was kind of shocked. And when she was telling me this, I thought, wow, I think there's a story there, because that could easily go so wrong. And I decided I wanted to bring it up to modern times, and I wanted to make it all female, because I've always been very interested in female power dynamics and twisty female friendships. Those are the kind of books I love to read, and the movies I love to watch, like Mean Girls and Heathers and, you know, Ruth Ware novels. And it just came to me kind of quickly, this sort of villainous Margot Banks and her gang of followers. And I knew that I wanted someone from the outside, you know, to get brought into their world and watch and see what happens. So that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Well, the protagonist, Sophie, kind of, what's so interesting about her is she subverts that kind of naive main character meets the troublemaker trope that we can often see in suspense. She's not like magically swept up into this world, this kind of nest of vipers of women. She actively chooses to participate. Did you always know that that's who she was going to be?
That is such a really great question. I've never consciously thought of it like that, but you're absolutely right. It wasn't like she was hoodwinked into the bad behavior. She did go along with a lot of it willingly. Even if she was a bit reluctant at first, she was pretty quickly sucked in. And I think so. I think even if it wasn't conscious, I definitely wanted the novel to ask the question, what if I followed my darkest desires versus repressing them? What would that look like? And I always knew I did want to write a book about a life that that becomes unraveled. And because I thought it would be fun to do that from like the safety of my own couch and keyboard. And so, yeah. And I wanted Sophie to also own her own desire. Like her husband is perfect, and there's no logical reason she should be doing these things, but she's very complicated. And as you sort of encouraged me to do during the editorial process, we really developed, her backstory and maybe what motivates her decisions and compulsions. Because, you can have it all, but then still be unsatisfied. And I think we see a lot, in film and in novels, like, if men go into infidelity or whatever bad behavior, it's like, oh, wow, that's interesting. And they just seem to have the freedom to do that. Whereas if women do it, they're just instantly bad. And it's like the question of the whole, a writer friend of mine termed it unlikable mom. But I wanted her to be very human and real. So I hope that answers.
Definitely she is. And it's true that women characters should be allowed to be as complex, bad, interesting as male characters have always been, which I think you've done so brilliantly in this novel. And now for a quick lightning round of book related questions. Are you ready? The last book, the last book that made you cry.
Well, it's actually a thriller, and it's Riley Sager's Survive the Night, and it's coming out this summer, and I was lucky enough to read an early copy. And it's so character driven that I got emotionally involved, which is, pretty compelling for thrillers.
Definitely. What is the book currently on your nightstand?
It's another advanced reader copy of a book that comes out in a few weeks, and it's Will Dean's The Last Thing to Burn, and it is phenomenal, and everyone should read it.
That's great. What is the last book that you gifted to a friend?
Okay, that is The Girls Are Also Nice Here by Lori Elizabeth Flynn, which is another dark, twisty take on toxic female friendships. It's exquisite.
And the book that you wish you could read for the very first time?
I think I'd have to say Maria Simple's Where'd You Go, Bernadette? Because it's so fun.
That's a classic. That is really fun.
Yeah.
And one last question, since we have an audience of librarians here, it's important to ask, what have libraries meant to you?
Really, they've been my refuge my whole life, especially in the long, hot Texas summers. As a little girl, it was always a good place to go and escape the heat. And I've always been such a bookworm. And then probably more importantly, as I was trying to develop myself as a writer and really study the craft and read as much as possible, you could go broke trying to buy every book you want to read. And so I found like the hold system at the libraries and being able to check them out. And it was like my Netflix, and it really helped me grow, I think, as an author, getting access to books that I wouldn't have been able to get access to otherwise.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much, May. Thank you so much for your time today. And we at Berkeley, we just cannot wait for readers to meet The Hunting Wives on May 18th. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Thanks, everybody.